Question for you. What do you do when a large number of people come to faith? One answer will be prepare for the baptisms. Another would be prepare for the backlash. Now, I don't dare say that on every occasion, if the gospel is clearly proclaimed, there will be a backlash. You don't see this at the beginning of Acts, for example, on the day of Pentecost. So those who received his word were baptized, and there were added that day about 3,000 souls. And Luke then goes on to record what happened in that new community that grew up. Day by day, attending the temple together, breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved. But you could argue that this is not typical. What we saw last week in this first of the virtual visits that we were doing to this eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea, that was more like it. We might think of those places like Ephesus, Philippi, and Athens as wonderful places to visit on a holiday. Only, as we all realise, holidays have been somewhat disrupted this last year because of coronavirus. So we're just visiting some of these wonderful holiday destinations this year by remote means, seeing them safely on the screen and reading about stuff that happened nearly two millennia back. So last week we visited Philippi, right up there at the top of the Aegean Sea. Paul had thought it would be a good idea to revisit some of the places he had previously gone with the gospel. And he was soon redirected to new areas. There was that strange vision calling him across the sea to the area of Macedonia. Shown there, we've got that red arrow on screen, going across from Asia Minor, Troas, and landing at Philippi. We'll go on from there in a moment, but I first want to give you a flavour of that earlier set of visits he'd made to let you see the pattern that had grown up. But the first cities that he visited were what we would call nowadays Eastern Turkey. You got those on screen, they're not particularly legible, but Iconium and Lystra and Derbe. There's another Antioch there, as well as the one that you can see right on the far right of that picture. And at the other Antioch, that one that is in that area with Galatia, with Iconium and Lystra, that area, that's the first one of all we read about with any detail. This is what happens as recorded in Acts 13. On the Sabbath day, they went into the synagogue and sat down. After the reading from the law and the prophets, the rulers of the synagogue sent a message to them saying, "Brothers, if you have any word of encouragement for the people, say it." Well, how about that? Here is an invitation to preach. So, of course, Paul takes it. And he comes out with a sermon that picks up on his Jewish history and shows that Jesus is the fulfillment of it. And there, for example, in Acts 13:22, of David's offspring, God has brought to Israel a saviour, Jesus, as he promised. And look, the people hear all of this and they respond. They want this Jesus. Well, when you see things like this, we bring you the good news that what God promised to the fathers, this he has fulfilled to us, their children, by raising Jesus. Well, that's the message. I think it's safe to say they would preach everywhere that Jesus has not just died, but has been raised again. Every place they go to. If people are prepared to listen through, unless people would prefer to remain enslaved. Because look, let it be known to you, therefore, brothers, that through this man, forgiveness of sins is proclaimed to you. And by him, everyone who believes is freed from everything from which you could not be freed by the law of Moses. So here is the response. Verse 43. And after the meeting of the synagogue broke up, many Jews and devout converts to Judaism followed Paul and Barnabas, who, as they spoke with them, urged them to continue in the grace of God. And it looks as if things are going to carry on growing and growing. Next week, the next Sabbath, almost the whole city gathered to hear the word of the Lord. You can see there's got to be a but, can't you? But when the Jews saw the crowds, they were filled with jealousy and began to contradict what was spoken by Paul, reviling him. And it seems that we're introduced now to a pattern which is going to continue. And the word of the Lord was spreading throughout the whole region, but the Jews incited the devout women of high standing and the leading men of the city, stirred up persecution against Paul and Barnabas, and drove them out of their district. The gospel spreads, but it causes changes in people's lives, of course, and those changes affect other people. You might view them as threatening or disturbing, something that they either reason or just react must be pushed back against. Here in Antioch, it was the Jews who felt threatened. Paul preaching Jesus as the fulfillment of Judaism, the Messiah, and therefore taking away the following, you might even say the power base of the religion's traditionalist leaders. Yeah, too right, they're going to push back. Not just in Antioch either, the pattern develops. Next stop is Iconium, Acts 14. Now at Iconium, they entered together into the Jewish synagogue and spoke in such a way that a great number of both Jews and Greeks believed. But the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brothers. Next, the success for the gospel down the road at Lystra. But Jews came from Antioch and Iconium, and having persuaded the crowds, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing that he was dead. Soon after that, there's a bit of a break. Back in the other Antioch in Syria. There it is, I'll put an arrow on that one for you. And then this time at Jerusalem, down the coast, bottom right of that map, discussing a more reasoned objections for some traditionalists trying to subject the new churches. We've got that described in Acts 15. Some men came down from Judea and were teaching the brothers. So I suspect they're claiming they come with the authority of the Jerusalem church, but they probably haven't got it. They're trying to say you've got to be proper Jews before you can be proper Christians. Unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. And after Paul had no small dissension, Luke loves that kind of phrase, doesn't he? Right. Not a small number of, no small dissension. He understates, he's almost a Brit. Had no small dissension and debate with them. Paul and Barnabas and some of the others were appointed to go up to Jerusalem to the apostles and the elders about this question. So then, after quite some time, the second missionary journey starts off, as we mentioned last week. But has all the controversy from that first missionary journey died down? Are they going to find synagogues now more accepting of this new spin on the old teaching? Now they've had a chance to think through it a bit more. Actually, not a bit of it. They're going to be hounded from city to city by people objecting to this novelty. Now, we're not told much about the places that they revisited, but when we get onto that new ground in Philippi, the stuff that we looked at last week, we should expect things to be different. How come? Remember the introduction to that account in Acts 16, verse 13. And on the Sabbath day, we went outside the gate to the riverside where we supposed there was a place of prayer. And we sat down and spoke to the women who had come together. Why a place of prayer instead of a synagogue? Remember, we said this last week. It looks as if there isn't sufficient of a Jewish presence in the town to actually constitute a synagogue. If there were a dozen or more Jewish men, they could constitute a synagogue, but there isn't. And it seems a reasonable inference to me, therefore, that there was very little organized Judaism in Philippi in those times. And yet there was still trouble when the gospel started taking root. Only this time it wasn't Jewish interests that were being challenged, but straightforward financial interests. Paul, you remember, casts out that spirit of divination from the slave girl who had a spirit of divination and brought her owners much gain by fortune telling. And when that spirit is driven out of that girl, And the fortune telling stops, where you can predict the response, can't you? When her owners saw that their hope of gain was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace before the rulers. And so this is a backlash on financial grounds rather than theological grounds. But Paul and his team move on from Philippi. So they went out of the prison and visited Lydia. When they had seen the brothers, they encouraged them and departed. And when they move on, the more normal pattern seems to kick in right away. So after a very long introduction, I could summarize today's passage in Acts 17 is that the Jews in Thessalonica react very badly to the declaration of the gospel, as you might have expected. But here we are in Acts 17, verse 1. Now, when they passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica. And maybe Luke records this to say, there's Jews in this city again. You've seen the pattern. You probably know what's coming. Yes, Paul is going to try to share the gospel in the synagogue. And sooner or later, there will be a backlash against the message and the messenger. And as we read earlier, that's precisely what did happen. In this section in Acts 17, we've got proclamation, we've got backlash, and then we've got pursuit. Here's the first episode from today. So there's a synagogue, and there's an evangelist in a new town. As Paul went in, note this phrase, as was his custom. And on 3 Sabbath days, he reasoned with them from the scriptures. Folks, what do we have in the way of customs, good habits, routine ways of doing things that you have considered and decided to adopt into your lives as the default options? I'm not just thinking in terms of evangelism, but that would be a good place to start. Do we make an effort to engage with people? Or do we prefer to withdraw and keep ourselves to ourselves? Even if that is more our nature, have we made a decision that we will engage with people, whether it comes so naturally or not? We've had a new neighbour recently. It could have been easy enough to just let him get on with occupying his new home. Actually, he came knocking on our door to introduce himself. But if he hadn't, will we have taken the initiative? But how are you ever likely to share the gospel with someone if you've never shared anything else with them? If you've never spent time talking with them? If you've never even noticed who lives around you? If you don't know what makes them tick, and you don't show any interest in it either, how will they ever discover what makes you tick or who makes you tick? Have you got customs about what you do if someone comes to you with a moan about someone else? Are you always going to believe that kind of salacious tale, or have you chosen? Have you made it your custom to stand back and refuse to get drawn into another round of character assassination? When you hear a news story, or see an advert, or read an internet article, is it your custom to assume it must all be true? Do you turn off your critical faculties because it's the BBC or it's your favorite Christian activist website? Don't they all have some kind of agenda of their own and therefore their own slant on things? I could go on with all sorts of things here as regards customs, but I really need to get back to Thessalonica. We've worked out already that it's not a carbon copy of Philippi. It's further west. It's the next major town along that Via Ignatia. Showed you that picture last week. And it's still there this week, 2,000 years later. It's the major east-west trade route. You can just about maybe see a red line squiggling across the middle of that. The major trade route that runs along the northern coast of the Aegean at that point. But there we've got it, something hopefully you can see. And there's Thessalonica pointed out, that the one big town to the left of Philippi. It's also at an intersection with a northwest major road And it's a port city. So once again, it's an important trading location. It's a big, major local hub. But while Philippi was an official Roman colony, Thessalonica wasn't. It was different. Back in 168 BC, they actually asked Rome to come in and take over the city officially to protect them from their enemies. Rome did that, but they actually allowed the Thessalonians considerable freedom in running their own affairs. So Thessalonica is not going to be so heavily weighted towards Roman culture as Philippi is. And perhaps that's why there is a synagogue here, but not in Philippi. There's not so much of ancient Thessalonica to show you as with some of these other places, though, because the location has just been grown and grown and built over and over the centuries. It is now Thessaloniki with an I. It's 1 million or so inhabitants. But when they were excavating a bus station, would you believe, in 1962, and digging down, they found some ruins underneath. And eventually, by the looks of it, they found something like this, showing part of that ancient city. And there's something which actually I think is very neat that has been discovered among these bits of Thessalonica that have been excavated. It's a single word. The same that we've got in today's passage on an inscription. In Acts 17, verse 6, we read, they dragged Jason and some of the brothers before the city authorities. Now, prior to that discovery, people had been saying, some Bible critics had been saying, that Luke, the writer, not just of Luke's gospel, but this book as well, Acts, saying that Luke really took liberties with facts. He made up things. And the word which he uses here, they would say, and we would convert it into the English, politarch. That's two Greek words, polis, city, and arch, meaning something to do with rule. Therefore, you've got the city authorities as the way it's translated there. But politarch is the word that Luke used, and people were saying until 1962, what a load of rubbish. He just made that up. Can't trust anything Luke says. What a rubbish historian. And then in those excavations, they find an inscription which uses that precise word. And it shows that Luke actually knew his stuff very well indeed. He was paying very precise attention to detail as he wrote. He's actually a very excellent, dependable historian. And that's what you'd expect, because that's what he said he was going to do when he started volume 1 of his 2-volume work, Luke's Gospel. It seemed good to me also, having closely followed all things for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you've been taught. And that's why Luke dug it out. Literally, they had to dig it out 1900 years later to give certainty about what had been happening. So back to the account of Acts 17. Paul preaching the gospel, we might say. But Luke uses here some very precise words too to describe what he's doing. He reasoned with them from the scriptures, explaining and proving. Getting the precise meanings of these words into English isn't that easy. But doesn't the fact that Luke uses 3 different words here show that Paul is taking different tacks to try to communicate this message here? He isn't just dumping a load of information. Well, this is my style of teaching, take it or leave it. So that reasoned word, the first one there that's highlighted, is the root of our English word dialogue. So it's not just one way giving information, but 2-way interactive discussion. And that's one of the reasons we do cafe church on Sunday evenings. Explaining is literally thoroughly opening, making sure people see the implications and finer details of what is being said, walking them through what this and that means, explaining what we should do by way of response if we believe that this is true, proving there. That's literally placing alongside, but it's often used to describe setting before someone, something like serving them a meal, ready and hopefully delicious to eat because it's attractively prepared. That's how Paul declared the gospel: reasoning, explaining, proving. But although there's another, but there is another word here, which just is highlighted now, that word proclaim. And that carries a clear note of authority here. Proclaim or preach in some translations. But that doesn't mean preach in the sense of, if you like, what I'm doing here, spouting from the front. I think it means that there is actually a whole breadth of ways in which to declare authoritatively this message about Jesus. If people don't get it immediately, then it takes time and patience to explain it in other ways and other words so that someone can more easily understand. It means listening to the people you're speaking to so that you can dialogue with them. Because there is a life-changing message that people need to hear. It's not about being nice people so that hopefully God will be nice to you. It's not about keeping all the right rules so that God has to be nice to you. It's about how God has already shown his love for people like us, people who are suffering from such a dire spiritual disease that it takes such a remedy as this to cure us. It was necessary for the Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead. And folks, do we actually believe that? That it was necessary for that to happen? That your sins and my sins are of sufficient magnitude as to make that needful? But there is nothing further now that is needed for it to be achieved. That we have nothing about ourselves to boast about in relation to our believing. It is all down to the grace of God in Jesus Christ. Only for the Jewish audience particularly, remembering he's teaching in the synagogue, here's a piece to the puzzle that they will be particularly sensitive to. This Jesus whom I proclaim to you is the Messiah, the Christ. And it works too. Look how Luke now records the outcome. And some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a great many of the devout Greeks and not a few of the leading women. But that's official Jews there to start with, if I can put it that way, plus a much larger proportion of those fringe adherents of the synagogue, mostly persuaded, but not quite persuaded enough to subject themselves to the full initiation rite to Judaism. But by the looks of it, I think that means those are people whose eyes have been opened relatively recently. And therefore, I think they are more ready now to accept more light again about Jesus. And therefore, there is a backlash. Even as I say that, isn't it obvious? A backlash is inevitable. Those people whom the Jewish hardliners, the Jewish traditionalists, have been working on for years, if you like, the fringe of their church, suddenly up and off, following Paul and Silas, there is bound to be a backlash. But the Jews were jealous. They didn't stop at just feeling jealous. They whip up a mob, taking some of them, some wicked men of the rabble. They formed a mob, set the city in an uproar and attacked the house of Jason, seeking to bring them, Paul and Silas, out to the crowd. And it's a typical mob. It's ill-informed. They've gone to the wrong place, so they don't get what they want, and then it turns ugly. When they could not find them, they dragged Jason and some of the brothers before the city authorities, shouting, "These men who have turned the world upside down have come here also, and Jason has received them. And they're all acting against the decrees of Caesar, saying there's another king, Jesus." Actually, a wonderful accusation. I mean, another king, Jesus, isn't that exactly right, actually? Wasn't that precisely the message from Jerusalem a couple of decades earlier? Where is he who has been born king of the Jews? It was confirmed from Jesus' own lips too. Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from this world. And you can see how this world's citizens are behaving, following their king, their Caesar. So Jesus is actually a far better king, isn't he? They don't behave in that way. This is a king who can conquer without armies, even though he can call upon the armies of heaven to come to his aid. And that thing about turning the world upside down, that's a lovely backhanded compliment too, isn't it? Yes, following Jesus does make a difference. If it makes a difference in enough individual lives, it will make a difference on a societal level too. To those just looking in, it will seem as if things are being turned upside down. Really, though, it's just starting the process of turning things the right way up again. And here, of course, it's an exaggeration born of the exasperation the spokesman of this mob are feeling. But it's surely got to imply that the Christians are involved in something very notable and in not just a few pokey little villages either. But also, of course, as you would expect in situations like this, there's going to be misrepresentation as well. And here's a very common one. Acting against the decrees of Caesar. Isn't that exactly the kind of thing we hear nowadays, leveled against believers in Jesus in all sorts of repressive regimes? They are acting against the ill-defined interests of the state. And therefore, of course, they can be arrested and locked away without trial. Folks, expect to be misrepresented by people who do not understand what following Jesus is all about, or people who are actively reacting against this. Expect to be quoted out of context, no matter how carefully you word everything you say. Only a couple of times has anything that I've done in church been quoted in the local papers. The first time I was quoted saying something, well, since they hadn't even phoned me up to interview me, they just made up a quote out of nowhere. The second time I was phoned up, and I was very careful with what I said, but it still got twisted. Expect people even to quote the Bible at you a bit twisted by people who are trying to score points and belittle you. I can remember back in my college days, there was a college debating society, and every few months or so, there was a provocative religious kind of debate topic. And one of those, the College Christian Union decided to go along in force to make sure the vote went the right way. But one of the guys trying to show how mean and vicious a tyrant God is, quoted from the Bible like this. God desiring to show his wrath. I was hopping mad when he did that. Do you know why? Actually, I have deliberately misquoted that myself in putting it on screen like that. So if I was going to quote it, I would have to notice the difference now. It's going to pop up on screen. You need those ... dots at the start, because if you're going to quote things properly, that shows that although it starts with a capital letter, it's not the first word in the sentence. But of course, this guy in the debating society didn't refer to that. What words did he leave out? Does anyone know? Two words that make a totally different complexion on this. What if God desiring to show his wrath? You see, deliberately misquoted. This was someone who actually knew his Bible enough to misquote it on purpose to score debating points. And people in this world will know the Bible well and will misquote it deliberately for something worse than just debating points. Expect at times to suffer libel or slander or unsubstantiated allegations if you stand for Christ. It is par for the course. It rankles not to be allowed to retaliate, but that would be to fight unholy fire with unholy fire. We have a different example to follow. When Jesus was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. Anyway, here is the magistrate's response to it all. I think they're rather dodging the issue here. I think they're looking for a quiet solution as far as possible. I don't really blame them, but I think it's keeping an uneasy peace. And the people and the city authorities were disturbed when they heard these things. When they'd taken money as security from Jason and the rest, they let them go. I don't think anybody was particularly happy by that, but maybe that's the best they could make of it. And the believers, by the looks of it, think it would be a good idea to cool things down. So they immediately sent Paul and Silas away by night to Berea. But having incensed the Thessalonian Jews sufficiently, there is pursuit. When they arrived, they went into the Jewish synagogue. So for Paul and Silas, it's business as usual. A new town, and Paul acting once again as was his custom. And at first, it looks as if things are going swimmingly. Now, these Jews were more noble than those in Thessalonica. They received the word with all eagerness, examining the scriptures daily to see if these things were so. Many of them therefore believed. Isn't that nice? Therefore, does that imply examine the scriptures daily? And therefore, as a direct, logical, obvious, natural response, believe. Many of them therefore believed, with not a few Greek women of high standing as well as men. But news travels. In this case, it travels backwards. But when the Jews from Thessalonica learned that the word of God was being proclaimed by Paul at Berea also, they came there too, agitating and stirring up the crowds. I just want to flag up a different ending to this section compared with last week's. Last time in Philippi, we saw Paul standing on his rights as a Roman citizen, insisting on fair treatment. But Paul said to them, they have beaten us publicly, uncondemned, men who are Roman citizens, and they've thrown us into prison. And do they now throw us out secretly? No. Let them come themselves and take us out. Here, it's really quite different. Then the brothers immediately sent Paul off on his way to the sea, but Silas and Timothy remained there. He might have been able to fight his corner there in Thessalonica, using his Roman citizen rights again. But he accepted an alternative, which, if you think about it, might have been a very clever move. He moves along and he takes the gaze of the agitators with him. But he leaves Silas and Timothy, good gospel men, able to continue their work quietly in his absence. Folks, some of us will tend to be timid and just cut and run immediately, first sign of trouble. I remember someone back in Harlow trying for the first time to join in with some door-to-door evangelism. And when they suffered the first impolite word, they resolved never to do it ever again. We need to be a bit tougher than that. But some of us also are just a bit too ready for a fight. We want to make points and stand on principle, we say. And yes, there are times for that. But there are also times when it's wise to choose which fights to engage in, or as we say, is this really a hill to die on? Is it that important in this case? Because not everything can be that important. Paul might have toughed it out in Berea, pursued by these Jews from Thessalonica, but he chose to move on. Because there are still new pastures ahead, new places where back in the middle of the first century AD, the gospel had not yet been heard. There were fresh people to tell the old story of Jesus and his love. A new visit for him in person. Athens, which is currently, so I saw on the news this week, besieged by wildfires. So maybe we better make that another virtual visit next week. What do you think? Let's pray, shall we?